Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR, a weekly podcast where we explore the forces shaping our roles today, from new technologies, shifting expectations, to tightening budgets. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell. Before we start, I'd like to thank our sponsors Foresight for their support of this episode. In the age of AI and ever-increasing complexity, Foresight have built a beautifully simple and powerful tool that generates an accurate workforce plan with only 5 minutes of line manager time each quarter. All they need to do is log expected growth, known levers, suspected levers, and that's everything from performance to flight risks, when Jimmy turns up in a suit for the first time ever. And their clever tech will turn everything into a clear map, complete with interventions that HR can take to reduce churn and an automated feed into your applicant tracking system so that your recruitment and talent acquisition team can get a rare lead on recruitment. Are you looking for that one easy change that makes a huge impact on your business? Then go to theforesight.co.uk and mention that you found out about them through the show, and you'll get a Friends of the Podcast discount. Great! Now on with the show. One of the defining features of today's HR landscape is the constant need for change. Responding to new technology, new ways of working, or to the newest of a plethora of perma-crises we seem to be faced with today. To say it can be overwhelming is really a bit of an understatement. And I'm a great believer in what I call borrowed brilliance. And I think that HR should always be on the lookout for excellence in other business functions and think about how we can adopt it ourselves. My guest today really embodies that. He's the Chief People Officer of Zappi, where he's been since the very beginning. He now leads their people and culture strategy, and he has achieved some pretty amazing things. They have a staff belonging score of over 90%. He has significantly reduced their gender pay gap. What's the secret, you ask? Well, Tom will tell us later, but really a culture of trust and transparency is absolutely there at the core. Very unusually, Tom comes from a product management background. So in today's episode, we're going to delve into the fundamentals of product management. We're going to talk about Agile, and we're going to talk about where those things can add value to HR. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Felix, for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you very much. Well, let's start where I always do. How did you end up in this crazy old world we call HR?
Yeah, it's funny, and it was very sort of circuitous. And when I tell people that my background was in product management, they sort of think, oh, that's quite a big leap. But actually, it wasn't really from my perspective. And yeah, so the start of my career, I was initially a researcher. Actually, I was going around interviewing people, doing qualitative research, initially social research, and then market research. And then I joined a company, ended up in a product management role, and built the first versions of this Zappi platform that we've now built into a business. And so at that point, my role was, working with technology teams, building digital products, meeting with customers, understanding their needs, and then turning that into technological solutions. And over time, what I realized is actually that wasn't really my passion. The kick I got out of it was working with the teams, trying to build a team culture that was conducive to really good results, but also like creating the conditions where people could be themselves, where people could, operate to like a really high level, but also just like have a lot of fun as well. And so I started moving to more team coaching, individual coaching, agile coaching, that kind of thing. I ended up leading a team of Scrum Masters and kind of looking at the organization and thinking like, how can we do better, both by our people, by our customers? How can we make technology work better for our customers and build like a really, really amazing culture? And at that point, I think the company got to about 150 people. We didn't have anyone working in HR. HR had a bit of a bad rep. I think you find this sometimes in startup businesses where the function is sort of seen as, okay, quite risk averse, quite protecting the business and all these sorts of things. Rather than like a value adding team, a team that's kind of bringing real value to the organization. And so we hadn't had HR up until then, and we got to about 150 people, and we said, do you know what, it's really crazy that there isn't somebody full time thinking about our employee experience. We're investing all this money in these amazing people, and actually there's nobody thinking, right, from end to end, how is that experience and how can we kind of improve and optimize it? And so for me, having done, I was always the one sending out engagement surveys. I was the one like coaching people, coaching teams. It ended up being a sort of natural sidestep to actually say, like, to do that full time and really lean into that sort of people development side of an HR role.
It's really interesting. I mean, 150 is big to get to without a focus on HR, and I know it's probably been diffused. It was probably diffused within managers who sort of thought the right way. You can do that with the right culture, but that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I think that, and I know we're going to come on to the technical skills that you learned in product management that have been useful in your people role. But do you think it was of benefit to you to have really been on that journey since the very beginning? You must have been pretty intimately knowledgeable about the commercial levers that drove the business, about the broader business strategy, about how product innovation sort of led to what that did to the client experience, and what that client experience did to the team that was working on the client, and how that fed back to the product in a way that I can't imagine many HR leaders were. So did that put you in a good position to immediately pin your people strategies to the broader business strategy?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's two sides to it. One is definitely when I first took this role, I felt a sense of sort of imposter syndrome of like, I suddenly went from going to tech meetups where I really understood it and I was, part of that community, to people and culture meetups where I really didn't, and I was entering into it. So there was a level of imposter syndrome, but certainly what it did bring is a real kind of understanding and empathy, understanding of the business and the strategy and the customers, but also empathy for the work that my colleagues in different teams were doing. And so I always say to my team, like, look, we have to be business people first. Like, I know that it doesn't always seem relevant to really go deep on the strategy or really go deep on like what our different teams are working on and understand how the customer's using the platform. It's like tangential to the work that you might be doing on a day to day, but it's so important, because unless you have that understanding and empathy, I think what often happens is we create these amazing initiatives and we put so much thought into the design, but we're not meeting people where they are, and so they fall a bit flat and they're not adopted and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, it's that mindset that I had when I initially took that role. Like, one, I sort of hire for that. So our Gwen in my team, who runs all of our L&D, she was an Agile coach as well. So she really gets it, all of how the engineering teams work. She really gets things around continuous feedback culture and all of that kind of stuff. And everyone else in my team who, people who maybe have a more traditional HR background, my main thing with them is like, we've got to be business centric first and then HR people second.
Right. I'm going to take us back one step, because a lot of our listeners will not be from tech companies.
Yeah, great.
What's an Agile coach?
Yeah, and Agile is really funny because it's a kind of industry that I think it developed over the last 20 years off the back of this Agile manifesto. And if you haven't read it, you should do, because it was like a treatise on how to do software development that's team centric. It's about self-organizing teams who work in iterative cycles, kind of developing as they go and getting feedback from their customers. And it was sort of written in response to the prevailing approach to building software over the last sort of 30, 40 years prior to that, which had been, you design all of the specs up front in a massive architecture document, and then you have a project plan which boils down to all of the different releases, and at the end it gets to the customer, and after that 18-month cycle, what you've built is so different to what you've originally thought that you were going to build and what was spec'd out, and it's also different because the market's changed. So the whole idea was to have a way of building software that was iterative and would get customer feedback as you go. And an Agile coach, their job is to sort of make that process run effectively, right? Help to coach the teams to adopt better ways of working, to keep kind of self-organization and kind of ownership within the team, and to support them to find more productive and kind of better ways of working.
Cool. And while we're on the glossary section,
yes,
product management.
Yes.
Could you give us a really quick definition of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if there's any product managers listening, they'll probably disagree with
It's fine. It's only HR and talent people, isn't it?
Well, like a product manager, I always think of them as like they're the CEO of their particular digital product, right? So it's their job to do discovery with customers, to understand what the underlying customer need is, and then to sort of help scope out what the solution would be. And then they work with an engineering team who will then go away and put that into practice in these like iterative sprint cycles, basically.
Fantastic. So let's get on to the meat of what I'm really excited to talk about today, which is what are the elements that you've taken from your product experience, your product background, that have served you well in your people phase of your career?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is like really being focused on the vision and where you're going and how you're adding value to the organization. And I think, like I said, I think in some startup businesses and even in some scale ups, businesses, I think HR sometimes gets a bad rep, and there are incredible people doing really, really important work. And I think there's a bit of a refocusing and a sort of positioning, which is actually we are a real like value add team. Our people are our biggest investment, and we're here to get the best out of them. So keeping in mind, like, what is your vision and how does that relate to the company vision? Because in between where you are today and where your vision is, there is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of complexity. There's not like a single roadmap of, there's not a Gantt chart that you can just work through to get to that vision. And so having that in mind, I think that's the main thing. And then within that, you have then the space to kind of experiment, to iterate, to listen. So that's the first thing. Keep your kind of vision and how you're adding value in mind.
I think that's really interesting, and it's a real theme. It's probably been an unexpected theme of the podcast so far, is this sort of really rapidly emerging need to be much more aligned to business objectives, and then also to recognize your commercial, the sort of the function's commercial role in the broader business's sort of commercial objectives. And it's sort of, when I reflect on it, I sort of really see you've got your strategy, you've got what your business wants to do. And for most businesses in the digital and service economy, you've got two ways of getting there. You've got tech things, and that's the internal processes and technology, and it's often the product that you're running. And you've got your people. And it seems to me that although people is a big focus at a board level, you talk to a lot of CEOs, what are you most worried about? Most worried about getting the right people, keeping the right people. That hasn't really filtered down enough into the organization or into the value, the sort of perception of value within the internal teams. You look at the most valuable teams, it tends to be the sales team and the delivery team, whether that's service delivery or whether that's technology delivery. And I think that the part that you just said there is that there's so much work that we need to do as people practitioners to really bring that value to light. And I'd love to hear some of the ways that you guys are doing that in Zappi.
Yeah. I would say that there's two things that immediately come to mind. First is like the explicit ambition that you have, because if your ambition is to, I want to be a good partner to the business, I want to help kind of, like I always think about like the processes that we run. We obviously have these core kind of business as usual processes. They're really important to the employee experience, recruitment, onboarding. In fact, a bit less so with recruitment because of just how important that is. But onboarding, compensation, all these sorts of things, and like I always measure those processes by they're operating well if there's no drama. If there's no drama, we've got our metrics. We want to make sure we're bringing brilliant people in, onboarding them, all that stuff. There's no drama, that's fine. But I think you have to go beyond that, to really demonstrate the value that you're adding, and to think, what's your like ambitious hook for the business? Like, how are you really going to help the business to achieve whatever the ambitious stuff that it wants to? So kind of couching it in that. And the second thing, and this is a real lesson I really learned this from one of our VPs of product, who this is his mantra, which I always try to keep in mind, which is fall in love with the problem, not with the solution. And I think so often, like, it's really easy to like see a problem, jump to a solution, and then like start iterating. And that's where I think sometimes you end up with these like very well-meaning initiatives that you try to bring in that just don't land. For all of the best change management in the world, they just don't get adopted. And so one of you mentioned kind of the skills and the capabilities, but one of the things I really kind of try to focus on with our team is systems thinking, and kind of trying to go a bit deeper into like, okay, what is actually going on in a particular problem space? And there are really simple tools, like things like 5 whys, where you ask like, okay, what's going on? What's the problem? Okay, but why is that happening? But why is that happening? But why is that happening? To get down to a kind of deeper level of understanding. And or there's there's things like systems mapping and all these kinds of things that you can do to say, let's try and understand the complexity, because when you get there and you do that, the solution is often like really self-evident. So that's one of the main things, I think, fall in love with the problem.
That's really interesting. I love the 5 whys. You did sound a bit like my 3-year-old.
Yeah, I know that.
But
feeling.
why? But why?
I know that feeling.
But why? But no, it was really, it was really interesting. On a walk back from nursery one day, I was like, I'm going to take it seriously. I'm going to answer his questions. Like, sort of, I'm going to answer them as if an adult was asking me these questions. And it's incredible how quickly you get away from the obvious answer of why we're going home. Well, we're going home because it's bedtime, and you just build it that next level deeper. Okay, why is it bedtime now? And you sort of start talking about why it's important to get your sleep or whatever it is. Why is that important? And then you realize actually how little how much you assume knowledge just based on what you've been told or what your standard operating procedure is. And I'm sure that if you really fall in love with that problem, like you're talking about there, if you're looking at okay, we've got a high attrition problem, or why do we have a high attrition problem? I don't know. We don't pay market rate, but why? Yeah. I bet you get some really interesting answers. And how hard is it to go those 5 whys deep?
I think it really depends on the topic and the domain. I think sometimes it's straightforward and you can do it yourself, and sometimes you have to bring other people around the table. And I think that's why one of the other skills of trying to apply a product management mindset is facilitation. It's the ability to bring a kind of cross-functional group of people together and have the confidence and the tools to guide them through processes like that, so that you develop your kind of shared understanding. I'm a massive believer in, like, people adopt what they help to create. And it's not always easy, like I said, because everyone's busy. Our priorities might not translate to each person's individual priorities when they're trying to sell or build or whatever they're doing. So being able to do that with nuance, I think, is really powerful. But there's a great kind of anecdote within the product world, which actually isn't true, I've learned recently, but is that they sort of was it Henry Ford who said, yeah, if we had just listened to people, surface level listened to people, we would have just made faster horses, And it's that perfect kind of idea of, actually, if you just take that surface level of need that you perceive, the solution that you end up coming with, you fall in love with that solution. It might not be really addressing the root cause in a way that a new technology or a new approach can do something that's truly transformational.
Great. That is super interesting. Can you give us an example of where that's, or just a couple of examples of where that applies to HR as opposed to a tech solution?
I think one area where this kind of thinking is really important is anything around culture change, because culture itself it's diffuse, it's complex, it's the product of everyone's sort of behaviors. So when you're trying to instill a new set of behaviors or shift a culture, I think operating in this way is really, really important. And we use the example of like the 5 whys, but there's another great model which I use quite regularly, which is like the iceberg model. And it's exactly like it sounds like. So what you do is you say, right, what are we actually observing? What are the things that we're observing? So maybe it's conflict between 2 teams. Okay, so what if that's the thing that we're observing? Now, what's happening over time? So that's the next bit. So that's still kind of above the waterline. What are the trends that we're observing over time? And then as you get further down, you start to think, well, okay, well, what are the assumptions, beliefs? What are the mindsets that might be driving what you're observing? And as you go down layer by layer, you start to uncover things that actually allow you to solve those problems. So whether that's addressing a sort of systemic conflict because there's some structural inefficiency in how 2 teams are organized. At the moment, we've got quite a complex go-to-market motion, which requires customer success, sales, different sales teams. You've got internal services teams, all of those sorts of things. So to get those teams humming, actually, there's structure, there's interpersonal stuff, there's like everyone's got their own underlying belief systems, and all these things come together. And so to understand that and to design that in a way that gets the best out of those people, I think requires a different kind of thinking. It's not a sort of procedural thinking. It's actually like a deeper level. Okay, let's think about this system, and then how can we run experiments to try and change it?
That's really interesting. And let's talk about change, because change just feels like it's getting bigger and bigger, and more change transformation just feels like it's becoming more and more of a function of the role, sort of leading importance. Obviously, product management's all about, like, really all about change and all about doing something new and creating something new. So are there any frameworks from that around, tracking change that would be useful?
Yeah. How nerdy do you want to go?
Let's go. Let's just do it. Let's just do it. Let's do it. Okay, nerdy, but every time you use an acronym, you have to explain what it means.
Yeah. Well, okay, it's not an acronym. So there is a model called Cynefin, which is a Welsh word. I can't even actually remember what it means, but it was originally designed by a guy called Dave Snowden, who was working for Intel at the time, and it's a complexity sense making framework, and I love it. I use it all of the time to decide what is the right approach to change that you want to see. And it basically says you can analyze any problem and put it in a series. You can classify a problem in a series of different ways. So is it a simple problem where, like, actually it's quite straightforward, we know like how to achieve this thing, cause and effect are really straightforward, it's probably something that you can automate, or it's something that you can just do over a checklist, right? Something like that. Or is it a complicated problem where actually you can still kind of do this thing? So like an engineering problem would be complicated because even though you need quite a complicated system to achieve what you want to achieve, all of the parameters are kind of known. You know what you're doing with it. If you build the system in the right way, you can give it a series of inputs and it will get a series of outputs. The other place is a complex problem, and this is what we're tending to deal with in HR, because they're these complex change problems. And when we talk about a complex problem, it means that we kind of know where we are, but we don't know if we design something. There's no way to tell what the output of that thing would be, because it's too complex. It's too unpredictable. There's people involved. People act in irrational and unpredictable ways. And so in a complicated world, in a complicated problem, a sort of procedural Gantt chart approach works quite well, because you can say, right, we know what we need to build to achieve this thing, so let's map out exactly everything that we need to do, let's assign them all to people, let's put it in a timeline, we'll just deliver all of this work, and at the end of it we'll be done. That doesn't work in a complex environment which is involving lots of people interacting in different ways, because you start to work and then the things that you're doing actually impact and change that system. So the only way to achieve success in a complex environment, to really achieve success, is to try stuff, to iterate, and then to learn as you go. And that's the whole basis of what Agile was centered on. Right?
That's so interesting. So just even as you were talking, the need to recognize what kind of problem you're dealing with is something that so few people do. You just like, all right, I've got a problem. Right, let's get solving it. Let's get the teams together. Let's do this, that, and the other. Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. I'm going to dig out a link and add that in the show notes.
I'll share it with you, because it's a good. It takes a little while to get your head around it, but when you do, and the mistake that we often make is we classify complex problems as complicated, and then you try to take this more procedural, more kind of waterfall approach to actually like working through the solution. And by the time you're done, you either haven't really addressed the root cause, or it's changed, or what have you, and you've missed out on this opportunity to sort of try stuff and to learn as you go.
So let's talk about complex problems just for a little bit more.
Yeah.
And how they pertain to the people world.
Yeah.
I definitely get how you would iterate and test complex problems on, I don't know, a new product, for example.
Yeah.
But if you've got, we've already talked about cultural change, so let's not do that. But let's say you've got a new reward policy. I think the temptation is to be like, right, we're going to roll this out over the whole organization.
Yeah.
Because we're going to go out for tender, we're going to build this great new policy. But as you say, you never know how people are going to react to let's shift bonuses to annual, or let's break them down to quarterly, or let's increase them or reduce them, or let's bring in new benefits to a certain seniority level. So how would you do that in that complex framework where you're trying to test?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. So it's your design and your release process, and fundamental to it is actually just listening, right? And I mean, it's something that I think as HR professionals, and I would put my hand on my heart as well. Like, we're all busy, and sometimes, like, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we don't listen enough. And by listening, I mean having conversations, but I also mean looking at the data, really understanding what's going on. And then I think there is, being quite intentional about your design and your feedback loop. So I'll give you an example. Like, we designed a sort of new employee hub around personal development. So it's like a one-stop shop where you can store everything related to your career development, and there's loads of different toolkits and all stuff in there, right? So in order to do that, we started with a load of discovery interviews. We did that with people from across the business. From that, we developed some initial prototypes. Then we did a round of beta testing where we got people involved in it. We actually sat with them. We did like user testing. We saw them like click through it. We asked them questions as they were going, all of that sort of stuff. All of learning as we go. So we'd start with that alpha testing. Then we went into beta testing, where we then, once we'd designed something and iterated it, we then just put it out into the wild for a small group, got them to use it and then give us feedback. And then after that, we were then confident enough to say, okay, let's go with it. So, and I think you can apply that to pretty much anything you're working with. And, there is, I get it that some of the projects that we work on can be kind of sensitive. Some of them, there's confidentiality around it and all those sorts of things. But instinctively, by principle, I sort of lean towards transparency. Let's trust people, that they can understand that sometimes we might be designing things or making things that are different or not perfect considering for what they would want, but because we're trying to take a wider view. So let's trust them, and then let's actually seek their feedback as we're designing this stuff. Because again, like, I really, really believe people adopt what they've helped to create.
So interesting. I love that you use the trust word. Again, a really big theme that's come up on the podcast since I started last year. It really feels like there's just not enough organizational trust, and I think one of the big failings there is trust goes hand in hand with transparency and good communication. And it just sounds like if you're saying to a group of people, hey, we're working on this, we want to make sure we've got it right. We won't have got it right first time around because we don't know we don't know whether you're going to like it or not. And the key thing here is that you use it and there's great adoption. So you're the alpha users. This is what you should expect. And then trust them to remember that you've said that, give you the feedback. Same with the beta. And then when it comes to the broader business rollout, I guess you say, we've alpha tested it, we've beta tested it. This was the feedback. This is what we put together. We're still open to some feedback.
Yeah.
And I do think that sometimes when people put a lot of time and effort into building something new, you want people to like it so much that in a sort of completely self-defeating way, you don't ask for anyone's opinion on it as you go, right?
Yeah, totally. And that trust topic is really interesting as well. And I remember talking to somebody in my team about this, about the product management of mindset. So like, right, team, just to reinforce, like, we are the product managers of our internal systems and processes. That means we're responsible for their success. We want to take a kind of people-centric design approach, all of these sorts of things. And someone from my team said, Tom, we've only just got management to stop talking about resources, and now you're calling everyone products. I was like, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. But no, I'm not calling everyone products. What I'm saying is the systems and the processes are products, right? And the people are our end users, right? And we have to be user-centric in the way that we design those things. And I think, I mean, a lot of what I'm talking about as well is like, this is the sort of the background and the to do this bit again. A lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is the background and the genesis of PeopleOps. Right, PeopleOps came from Google as an idea of a function, and it shares a lot of these sorts of things. And some of the initial thinking around it was basically to say, if we design stuff in this way, we'll design it better. Our teams will be less involved in the day-to-day of like running these services, so we can continue to kind of up our game, but we can also spend more time on the really like human work that actually you can't manage in that way, which is like coaching people, getting into the really gnarly problems that people have got and helping like mediate and facilitate, and really helping to kind of get to know people and helping people to find themselves in your organization in different ways. So like I sort of see this way of working, I mean, it achieves better results, but it also kind of frees you up to do the stuff that I actually really love doing, which is like sitting with people and understanding what makes them tick and helping them do better.
Fantastic. That's awesome. I want to use one more, just dip into one more product management framework or tool that I think that personally I love and I find really helpful, but the Kanban board as well. I know it's super basic, but could you just talk our listeners through what that is, how it's used in Agile, and where, and it just feels like a really easy win for other teams to pick up as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think so. So Kanban's great. It's has its sort of roots in like Japanese automotive manufacturing, where they were looking at kind of reducing waste and by waste I mean like inefficiencies in their manufacturing processes, and it's very related to this like whole concept of like Kaizen, which is that whole thing of like reducing waste. But it's really interesting because a couple of years ago, I was like, right, I need to have more of a people strategy. I want to have like a clear people strategy and roadmap that aligns to the business. And I did all of this. And we spent like 3 weeks like designing this really amazing strategy that was going to last us through the year and all that kind of stuff. And about 8 weeks later, some fundamental shifts happened that we weren't expecting, and we threw the whole thing out and we started again. And so that leads, that experience really led me to say, actually, do you know what? Like, let's chill out a little bit with the strategy and let's think about the strategy as we have our employee experience, and then within that, we're responsible for every different area of that. Let's make sure that we have a vision for each of those areas, and then let's have a clear feedback loop. So we try stuff, we listen, we learn, we do it like that. And Kanban is a great way to support that way of working, because basically all it is, like at its most basic, a Kanban board is it's a task board with like, you can have your different kind of columns in that task board, label them whatever you want. But in its most basic, it's the stuff that we're going to do, it's the stuff that's in progress, and it's the stuff that's done, right? And you just meet at a regular cadence to say, right, what are we all working on? What everyone's working on is completely transparent because you can see it on the board, and you just track work as it goes through the board. And then what it allows you to do is start playing around with your team efficiency. So there's this concept of like work in progress limits. So how much work is good enough? What's the right level of work for you as a team to have in progress at any one time? And your job as a facilitator of this process is to like increase the throughput of work, right? So you're kind of optimizing how you work. You're doing retros quite regularly to sort of say, like, how is it working? How are we doing? All of that kind of stuff, with a goal of just becoming more efficient and getting more work done. So it's a great way to organize when there's a lot of uncertainty, because you're not like committing to, right, we're going to finish all of these tasks in the next like month or in the next 6 months or whatever it is. You're just saying, we're just going to keep reprioritizing as we go.
And it's really sensible. And the reason we use it when we're doing a sort of talent transformation program with our clients, right? Because as you say, I mean, in the last 2 years, I can't think of 3 months where something hasn't seriously changed. You've got the broader market context. You've got sort of global macroeconomic pressures, and then you haven't even gotten to what's happening within the company and the funding and the senior management changes and da 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 da. So that's a really and I think without that kind of overarching sort of vision in the other sense of the word, like being able to see what's going on, I think that enablement functions like people and like talent acquisition, we are guilty sometimes of thinking, well, everyone can see that we're working hard and therefore they must see the value in it. And actually, if you've got a Kanban board that everyone can have a look at, they can see, oh yeah, they're working on some really important stuff. Oh, they've done some really important stuff. I forgot they did that. And it's amazing how today's really exciting deliverable becomes just assumed as part of we've had that forever, haven't we?
Yeah.
And everyone's busy. Everyone sort of forgets, and you kind of take it for granted. But it's just really I think those sorts of boards really help to tie back to business value as well.
Yeah, totally. And you know, when I talked about listening, I think there are so many different levels of listening, and one is actually really being attentive to what's going on in your team. And when you're super transparent about the work that you have in progress, the stuff that's on the backlog, if you're really kind of cognizant of that, it starts to tell you something about what's happening in the organization. Why is it that these things that we originally thought were important never seem to get up the top of the priority list? Why is that thing being stuck there for like 4 weeks? What's going on here? Let's talk about it. Let's, you know, just having that transparency of work is actually a really important thing for understanding what's going on too.
That's really interesting. Tom, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.